Hello everyone, this is Y. Manohar Reddy, Department of Cybersecurity, Institute of Aeronautical Engineering. Today I am going to explain about the concept of recoverability in DBMS. So explaining about the recoverability. So before going to explain about the recoverability, we have to understand that what is the concept of serializability, what is meant by schedule. That is what we already discussed in the previous session. So what is meant by schedule actually? So a transaction is going to be scheduled for executing the DBMS is called as scheduling. So scheduling of all the transactions simultaneously or non-simultaneously. That is nothing but a serial scheduling and a non-serial scheduling. So that is what we discussed in the previous session. So today we are going to recover the recoverability of the schedule. So today we are going to discuss about the concept of recoverability of schedule. So why we are going to recover the transactions? Actually, due to some failures, the transactions may get failures. So due to some system crashes, logical failures, or depending upon the different types of failures, the systems is going to be transactions failure. So to recover the transactions, we have some techniques. So how we are going to recover the transactions? So recoverability of schedule or scheduling the transactions. So sometimes a transaction may not execute properly or execute completely due to some software issues, system crashes or hardware failures. So sometimes the transactions may get failure because of the software issues, database software issues, and the system crashes depending upon the operating system crashes, and hardware failures depending upon the devices failures. So what we have to do, the failed transaction has to be rolled back. The failed transaction has to be rolled back because to achieve the database from the transaction point of view, you have to roll back that failed transactions. You have to roll back that failed transactions. But some other transactions may also have used value produced by the failed transactions. That means sometimes some transactions are depending upon another transactions. Sometimes some transactions are depending on another transaction. At that time, we have to recover this transaction based on that transaction, failed transaction. So indirectly, we are going to recover those two transactions. So we also have to roll back those transactions also. The transactions are dependent if and only if it get failures any one of the transaction, then other may get affected. So we have to roll back each transaction. That means two transactions you have to roll back it. So from this diagram, we have to understand that there are two transactions. One is transaction 1 and the second one is transaction 2. And when we are executing the transactions are default stored in the buffer space. Similarly for the transaction 2 also buffer space. So when we are reading that operation, when we are performing the read operation on the transaction, the value is A equals to 6500. Now if I debit some 500 amount from the transaction 1, then the amount is 6000. And if I access that amount, then it will show 6000 for the transaction 1. But after some time, the transaction 2, if it is going to read the transaction 1, what will it displays? It displays 6000 amount. When I credit 1000 rupees, I am performing a write operation on this transaction 2. Now the transaction amount is 7000. So if I access that amount, what will be the amount? 7000. Now I committed the transaction. Here the transaction 1, we have done updates, that is debiting the amount 500 rupees from the 6500, but it is not committed. When I am performing transaction 2 and crediting the 1000 rupees, and after performing write operation, I am committing the transaction. So this is the committing transaction, this is not committed transaction. So after committing the transaction, now what will be here the failure point occurs at the transaction 1. So after getting the failure, you are going to get the commit. You are going to commit the transaction. So at that moment, we may not recover the transaction 1 because the transaction is not committed before it is processing for the transactional 2. Before it is processing for the transactional 2. So at that moment, the transaction 1 is may not recover. So that is nothing but irrecoverable schedule. That is nothing but irrecoverable schedule. That means the schedules of the transactions which may not be committed and occurs the failure point. At that time, the transactions may not roll back. The transaction may not roll back. So at that point of view, you can say that that is a irrecoverable schedule. So that means the schedule will be irrecoverable if Tj is nothing but a transaction 2 and Ti is nothing but a transaction 1. So transaction 1, transaction. So if transaction 2 reads the update value of transaction 1, then transaction 2 is committed before transaction 1 commit. So the transaction 1 has to commit before. So after that transaction 2 committing, the transaction 1 is going to be committed. So that means the failure is occurred if and only if after committing the transaction 2. So that's why you are not going to recover or roll back the transaction. You are not going to recover the transaction. So that is a type of irrecoverable schedule. Irrecoverable schedule. So there are different types of recoverability process actually. So in that, one process is irrecoverable schedule. That means if and only if the transactions may not be committed, then you are not able to roll back. We are not going to roll back the transaction, the not committed transaction. So from this diagram, we can say that the above table 1 shows a schedule which has 2 transactions. So 2 transactions are there. T1 reads and writes the value of A, and that value is read and written by transaction T2. So from that point of view, transaction 2 commits, but later on after committing the transaction 2, the T1 or transaction 1 is going to be failure. After committing this transaction 2, the transaction 1 is going to be failure. So T2 should also be rollback. So T2 should also be rollback actually, because it reads the value written by T1. So it depending upon the transaction 1. The transaction 2 is depending upon the transaction 1. So if we want to roll back the transaction 1, again you have to roll back the transaction 2. But the transaction 2 is committed. So we are not going to roll back that transaction until and unless transaction 1 is not committed. So here, but T2 can't be rolled back because it is already committed. So it is already committed. So this type of schedule is known as irrecoverable schedule. So irrecoverable schedule means the transaction if and only if it is not committed. The transaction if and only if it is not committed, then the rollback of the schedule is not possible. Rollback of the transaction is not possible. So at that moment, we can say that it is an irrecoverable schedule. Irrecoverable schedule. So, and the next one, this is the recoverable with cascade. So see here. So this is the second type. One is cascade with rollback. Cascade with recoverable with cascade rollback. So here, the transaction 1 performs read operation and debit operation and write operation. And the next transaction 2 also read operation performs read operation and write operation. I mean credit operation. Then next write operation. So here read and write operations are performed, but they are not committed. But at some point of time, transaction 1 get failure point. Transaction 1 get failure point. After that failure point, it is committed. So after committing the transaction 1, you are going to commit the transaction 2 also. Now, we can recover the transaction 2 along with the transaction 1 because the transaction 2 is committed after committing the transaction 1. After committing the transaction 1. So before committing the transaction 1, if transaction 2 is committed, then it is not possible to recover the transaction. But here what it is going to say, the transaction 1 occurs with the failure point after committing the transaction 1 only, the transaction 2 is going to be committed. After transaction is committed, transaction 1 is committed, only the transaction 2 is committed. So now you can recover the transaction 2 as well as transaction 1 because they are dependent to each other and they are committed one after another. That means the transaction 1 is committed before committing the transaction 2. So after committing the transaction 1 only, transaction 2 is committed. So if and only if we can say that the transaction has to be rolled back both depending upon their transactional types. So here the transaction 2 is rollbacked and the transaction 1 also rollbacked. So here we can see the above table 2 shows the schedule with the true transactions, and the transaction T1 reads and writes A, and that value is read and write by transaction 2 also. But later on T1 fails. So up to this the T1 transaction 1 and transaction 2 is not committed. Now what it is going to say, T1 has failed right now. Due to this we have to roll back T1. So we have to roll back T1 means you have to commit it. So after transaction fails you are committed, then T2 should be rolled back because T2 has read the value written by T1. So as it has not committed before T1 commits. So that is what we said already. As it has not committed before transaction 1 commits, we can roll back transaction T2 as well. We can roll back transaction T2 as well. So it is nothing but recoverable with cascade rollback. So it is nothing but recoverable with cascade rollback. So that means transaction 2 is going to be rolled back if and only if it is depending upon the transactional 1. It is depending upon the transactional 1. So if you want to recover the transaction 2, you have to recover the transaction 1 also, because the transaction 2 is committed after committing the transactional 1. After committing the transaction 1. So that it is called as recoverable with cascade rollback. Recoverable with a cascade rollback. So here the schedule will be recoverable with cascade rollback if T2 reads the updated value of T1. So T2 reads the updated value of T1. So commit of Tj is delayed till commit of T1. That means the T2 has to be waited for some time for committing the transaction 1. So after committing the transaction 1 only, up to that T2 is going to be delayed to commit the transaction because it is waiting for the transaction commit for the first one. So after committing the transaction 1 only, transaction 2 is committed. So that is nothing but recoverable with cascading rollback. Recoverable with a cascading rollback. And here the next type is a cascade-less recoverable schedule. Cascade-less recoverable schedule. So here the transaction 1 is there and the transaction 2 is there. The transaction 1 performs read operation and debit operation and write operation. After that it is committed. And the second transaction performs read operation, performs credit operation, performs write operation. After that it is committed. So from this figure we can say that the transaction 1 updates all the values and it is committed. Similarly, the transaction 2 is also update all the values and it is committed. So individual transactions, they two are individual transactions. So that if we recover the transactions individually, that is we can say that a cascade-less recoverable schedule. Cascade-less recoverable schedule. So that is we are going to say here the read of the transaction and debiting the transaction and write the transaction and committing the transaction. So we already said that all the transactions are depending upon three operations, depending upon three operations. So the three are nothing but one is read operation, and the second one is write operation, and third one is commit operation. So one is read operation, then next write operation, and then next commit operation. So if you want to roll back the transactions, the transactions before has to be committed. So after committing the transactions only, you are going to roll back it. So these individual transactions are failure and they are committed. So individual transactions are going to be rolled back. So that is nothing but cascade-less recoverable schedule. That means cascade-less are nothing but they are not depending on one to another. The transaction 1 is not depending on transaction 2, or transaction 2 is not depending on transaction 1, vice versa. So those two transactions are individual, and those two transactions are occurred with the failure points, and those two transactions are committed, so that they can recover itself. They can recover or roll back the transactions individual. So this is about the recoverability of the transactions in the database management system. And the next topic is multi-version schemes of concurrency control with example. So in this, what we are going to say, we are already have that idea on concurrency control mechanism. So concurrency control mechanism, it is used for occurring the concurrent execution, and it is used to stop the problems on concurrent execution. So for that, we already discussed the different types of protocols in the concurrency control protocols. There one is lock based protocol, and the second one is the timestamp protocol, and third one is validation based protocol. So in this multi-version protocol, that means the protocol forms a different versions. So for that, the protocol having some different types of information like content, write timestamp and read timestamp. So multi-version protocol minimizes the delay of reading operation and maintains different versions of data items. So data items are nothing but records. Records existed in the files. So all the records are nothing but data items. So maintain the different versions of these data items. So here the multi-version protocol minimizes the delay of reading operation. That means all the transactions are going to have the more time to read the operation. So all the transactions has to be weighted actually. So to minimize the delay of reading operation and maintains different version of data items. So for each write operation performed on the transactions, it creates a new version of transaction data, so that whenever any transaction performs read operation to read the data, then appropriate created data version is selected by the control manager to make that read operation conflict free and successful. So that means, so it identifies all the readable transactions and it identifies all the writable transactions. So multi-version protocols maintains different versions along with the content, along with the information like content, write timestamp and read timestamp. So whenever the multi-version protocol started to perform on the transaction, it separate all the readable transactions and it separate all the writable transactions. So whenever the write operation and new version of the data, when the write operation and a new version of data is created automatically, then that new version contains some information like this. So the version attribute or version field contains content, write timestamp, and read timestamp. So these three are the information attributes for this multi-version protocol. So one is content, and the second one is write timestamp, and the third one is read timestamp. So multi-version protocol maintains these three information attributes to maintain that content. That means this field contains the data value of that version, and write timestamp. This field contains the timestamp of transaction whose new version is created. So new version is, whenever the new version is created, automatically all the writable transactions are stored in this write timestamp. All the writable transactions are stored in write timestamp. And then next, read timestamp. So this field contains the timestamp of the transaction that will read that newly created value. So only readable transactions are stored. So the transactions are depending upon different types. One is read transaction. That means you are going to read the transaction, like checking the balance account. That is a read operation. And updating the balance, that is a write operation. Updating the balance or withdrawal the balance, that is write operation. You are performing write operation on the data. So that after performing this read or write operations, the transactions are going to be committed. After performing this read or write operations, the transaction is going to be committed. So this multi-version protocol maintains that all the readable transactions in the read timestamp and all the writable transactions in the write timestamp, so that there is no transaction is going to be wait for a longer time. No transactions are going to be wait for a longer time to execute. So if you want to execute the read operation on transaction, then the transaction is going to be performed with read timestamp value. And if any transaction is going to be perform on the write operation on the transaction, then it retrieves or it calls the write timestamp, so that there is no time to wait for the longer time to execute the read or write operation on the transactions. So now let us understand this concept using an example. So let transaction 1 and transaction 2, those two be a true transactions, have timestamp values. One is 15 and the second one is 10 respectively. So the transaction T2 calls for write operation. So whenever the transaction T2 is calls for write operation, that means indirectly we are performing write operation on transaction 2 from the database. So as T2 calls write operation, then a new version of data value X is created. So whenever the write operation calls automatically, the new version of data value is created. So that contains what value of X it contains, and timestamp of T2, timestamp of the transaction also it contains. So and the timestamp of that transaction which will read and it is stored. So but in this case no one is reading the newly created value, so that the field remains empty. That means whoever comes for the write operation or read operation, that stored in the write or read stamp, so that value is only readable. That is previous transaction, that is the T2 that is having the transactional value 10. So now let the transaction T1 having timestamp 15 and call for a read operation to read the newly created value. Then the newly created variable contains will be the 10 as well as the 15. So this is the newly created value and this is the world created value, world readable value, and this is the newly created value. So this is the world readable value, means world readable value, that is world accessing value. So this is newly created value, that is newly writable value. newly writable value. So that the multiversion protocol maintains that all the transactions are in the write timestamp as well as read timestamp. So all the transactions, readable transactions are in read timestamp along with the data item and timestamp of the data item, along with the timestamp and along with the read operation of the transaction and along with the timestamp of the data item. So that the transaction 1 and transaction 2 both are created with this read or write operations. Both are read or write operations. So this is the way we can understand this multi-version protocol maintains that the values of transaction 1 and transaction 2 is updated based on the read or write operation. So here we can have some important cases by for doing this all the read or write operations in the timestamp of values. So here, if timestamp of T2, that is nothing but transaction 2 time is less than or equal to timestamp of T1. That means transaction 2's time is less than or equals to T2 is less than or equals to T1. Then what will happen? So read operation is performed by the transaction 1. In this case, content of X is written to T1. So read operation is performed on transaction 1 so that the content of X is returned to 1. And when the write operation is performed by T1, in this case, T1 will be rollbacked. T1 will be rollback if timestamp of T1 is smaller than timestamp of read operation. Timestamp is smaller than timestamp of read operation on X. And if timestamp of T1 is timestamp of transaction 1 is equivalent to timestamp of write operation, then new version is created. New version is created again with new contents. So all these read and write operations are performed based on the timestamp values of the transactional 1 and 2. So these read and write operations are performed based on the timestamp values of the transaction 1 and transaction 2. So this is the way we can understand to perform the read and write operation on the new version is created. So this is the way we can understand this multiversion scheme of this one. So up to this, what we understand from this session. So in this session, we are understanding that first of all, the concept of recoverable schedule. So what is meant by recoverability of the schedule actually? So whenever the transactions are executed with the failures, the transactions are executed or exited with the failures, so that cases we have to roll back the transactions actually. So that is nothing but a process of rollbacking the transactions. The process of rollbacking the transactions in a scheduling mechanism is called as recoverability of schedule. And there are different types of recoverability of schedules. One is irrecoverability schedule. And the second one is cascade with rollback. And next third one, cascade-less rollback. So irrecoverable schedule. That means if any two transactions are depending upon one another, then if one transaction is committed and the other one is not committed, then the two transactions are not going to be rollback. So at that moment, we can say that it is a irrecoverable schedule. Before recovering the transactions, we have to understand that all the transactions are performing three operations. One is read operation, second one is write operation, and the third one is commit operation. First one is read operation, second one is write operation, and the next commit operation. So if these three operations are performed, then there may be a chance to roll back the transactions. So if the transaction is not committed, any of the transaction is not committed, then it is said to be irrecoverable schedule. And The next one, the transaction committed, if and only if the transaction is committed for each and every one. So at that moment, we can say that it is a cascading rollback with cascade, rollback with recoverable with cascade rollback, recoverable with cascade rollback. So what we are going to say here, so we are having the transactions, along with the transactions, depending upon the transactions, if one is committed and the second one is also committed, if one is committed and the second one is also committed, then we can able to recover the transaction based on one transaction. So if T1 is committed and T2 is also committed, then you can recover the schedule of the transaction depending upon one transaction to another transaction. So that is nothing but recoverable with cascade rollback. Recoverable with cascade rollback. And recoverable with irrecoverable with cascading rollback. And next one, cascade-less rollback. Cascade-less rollback. That means cascade-less is nothing but they are not depending on the transactions. One transaction is not depending upon another transaction. So here, from this diagram, the transaction 1 performs read operation, write operation, commit operation individually. And similarly, the second transaction also performs read operation, write operation, commit operation individually. So those two transactions are individually may get failure. At that moment, they can those two transactions get rollback. Those two transactions get rollback. So that is nothing but cascade-less recoverable schedule. Cascade-less recoverable schedule. So this is the way we can understand 3 recoverability of the schedules. And the next one, multiversion schemes. Multiversion schemes of concurrency control. So there are different types of concurrency control protocols are there. One is a lock-based protocol, and the second one is timestamp-based protocol, and the third one is validation-based protocol. Validation-based concurrency control protocol. So here in this protocol, what we have to understand means the multi-version protocol creates a new version for the data items to read and write operations. It is created a new versions for the read and write operations. So why it is creating means it minimizes the delay for reading operations and maintain different versions. So all these versions are containing information attributes called as content, write timestamp, and read timestamp. Content, write timestamp, and read timestamp. So these 3 timestamps are maintaining all the transactions. So what we have to understand here, all the readable transactions are going to be stored in read timestamp, and all the writable transactions are going to be stored in write timestamp, so that whenever the transactions are going to be executed, if it is performing write operation, then the write timestamp is going to be executed. Write timestamp is going to be executed. So that is what we have to update all the values here. The transaction 1 and transaction 2 contains values. So at this moment, the transaction 1 is updated with the new versions. Values contains 10 and 15. So this is all the cases of recoverable, or all the cases of concurrency controlling the execution. Concurrency control the execution. So concurrent execution is appeared in the transaction management. So how to control that concurrent execution is this example for controlling the concurrent execution. So this is all about concurrency control protocol in the multi-version scheme of protocols. Thank you.
Like, share and subscribe. Hit the bell icon for more updates.